Hello, everyone. I'm really honored to be here with you today to talk about something that I think is beautiful, inspiring, and very important. And today, as you can see by my background, that I'm actually in a hotel room in St. Charles, Illinois, because in the other room, they're starting to take photos for the wedding of Jessica's brother, and we've come to the United States. And what that means is that I am currently not in the Guane territory of the Northern Andes. Right now, I am in Ojibwa territory. I'm in the land of the Ojibwa people, who are also connected with the Chippewa and are part of the Algonquin language family. And so I'm in the territory of a different set of indigenous people, which feels very, very appropriate to me because today I'm going to be attempting in our session to dispel and release the illusion and the pathology that the Algonquin peoples call wetiko. And so we're going to be dispelling wetiko today, and it feels very appropriate to be doing that from the land of Algonquin people. And the Ojibwa family is a tribal family with several tribes that are connected from the kind of New England area and Nova Scotia all the way down to this area of the Midwest. And it's also appropriate to know that the people of this area were in a hotel right next to the Fox River, that they were displaced in the 1800s by the incoming numbers, growing numbers of settlers from Europe, and were displaced eventually to Oklahoma and to Kansas. So there are Algonquin reservations in parts of the Great Plains and the western part of the Midwest from these people that were displaced from here. And I say this in part to honor the territory that I'm in, but also because part of what we're going to be doing today is walking in the dreamscapes of some of the ancestral peoples to try to remember how to connect with the earth in the ways that our own ancestors might have done. And so today we're going to be talking about awakening your dreamer. And for those of you who are familiar with the Pachamama Alliance, they have been offering a course and training for something like 15 years now, for quite some time, called Awakening the Dreamer. And I take inspiration from their work, from the Pachamama Alliance, to name today's session. But what we're focusing on is not awakening the dreamer, but how you are a dreamer and how you can awaken to your role as being one of the dreamers who is helping create the future of our home planet. And so with that said, I'd like to begin our session today. So here we go. This is a topic that I feel is deep and profound and also very important for us. And so I want to jump right in with this beautiful artwork. I do not know the artist, but this artwork is meant to signify what the people of the Inca tradition in the central part of the Andes of South America, when they talk about the earth goddess, they name her Pachamama. And this is an artistic depiction of Pachamama, which is the earth mother being alive within the landscape, giving birth to all life, and continuing her relationship with the masculine energy of the sun and the feminine energy of the earth as the great fertile land of reproduction, sexuality, creativity, and life. And today we're going to be talking about how each of us can awaken your dreamer in service to regeneration of the earth. And I want to start today's session by asking a question and then attempting to sketch part of its answer, which the question I have here is, when did the universe learn how to dream? And what I mean to ask here is in two parts. Has the universe always been dreaming, including giving birth to planets that have life upon them and dreaming well before humans came into being? And also, when did the universe give rise through its natural evolutionary process to beings who are capable of dreaming on behalf of the universe, so that the universe itself contains beings within the universe who are capable of dreaming, and that those dreams can become expressions of the universe at the same time. This is a thought that I find quite amazing, which is that as human beings, with our advances in technical and scientific knowledge, we actually know how the sun and our planets formed. We know that there was a first generation star, that it grew old and died and formed a supernova and exploded. And in the interstellar space that was left, there was a Magellanic or a nebular cloud. And this nebular cloud was the dust that aggregated and formed an accretion disk rotating, and that at the center of it was the heart of the gravitational pull, forming our sun. And in the rings that formed around this rotating disk of matter, aggregated and formed all of our planets. And that this process took fold over the span of about 1 billion years. This is something that's actually known and is very well supported by a large amount of evidence. And we are able to know this, which begs the question, how could the universe both have this process unfold and then also eventually give rise on one of its planets to a type of species that could come to know this story? This is like a fantastic story, an incredible epic narrative, the great epic of evolutionary history for the cosmos. And human beings have figured it out and actually know this story. It's kind of an amazing thing to ponder that we can know this. Also, we can know approximately when the Earth was born and the maximum extent of time until the Earth dies, because of what we know in astrophysics and the evolution of a star across its lifetime. So we know that roughly 10 billion years after the Big Bang, the Earth formed. And then we know that a maximum of 10 billion years later, our sun is going to expand into a red giant and grow so large that the volume of the sun will take in Mercury, will take in Mars, will take in the Earth, and will consume and destroy our planets, because the outer perimeter of the sun will include the orbits of these planets. So we know that the maximum remaining lifetime of our Earth is only about 6 billion years away. But this also means we know that the Earth was born. We know that life exists on our planet for a limited amount of time. And we know that our Earth, she will someday die. And we humans, as part of the Earth, are very unlikely to outlive our home planet. So we will die before our home planet gives up the ghost and stops having life upon it. What's amazing is that we can know this, and we can be able to tell the story of when and how the Earth was born. We can know that the Earth is a being who lives, a living planet, and that someday she will die. If you want to read how the Earth is likely to die, this is the only book I've ever found that attempts to explain it, by astrobiologists Peter Ward and Don Brownlee, The Life and Death of Planet Earth. I read this book about 4 years ago while hiking in the northern Cascade Mountain range of Cascadia in the Pacific Northwest of North America. And as I walked among those folds of rock forged by continental movements and plate tectonics, I pondered the eventual death of my home planet and realized I was capable of imagining it. It was quite a powerful insight for me at the time. So if you want to know more about this, get a copy of this book. Here's another thing. If the Earth has a limited lifetime, as we can see here, of about 10 billion years of maximum, and we know that the Big Bang occurred and that there's been a cosmic evolution building up to the present day, we can say that once upon a time, there was a species, humans, that evolved who was capable of telling the story of her planetary mother. Humans can tell the story of our planetary mother. So what else could this amazing species learn how to do? What other stories could we tell? See, our species has cognitive and social abilities that are unlike any other. We actually have a lot of hubris and arrogance in the history of science, where people presumed human exceptionalism in ways that turned out not to be true. For example, humans are the only animal that has communication. Humans are the only animal that have language. Humans are the only animal that have intelligence. Each of these ideas and their sweeping generality have been disproven as we've confirmed for non-human species that they do indeed have these features. But as we talked about in the first of our webinars, the ability to have cumulative cultural evolution seems to be unique to our species, and it is connected to our cognitive abilities and our language capacities, our ability to build upon the semantic or the meaning-making part of our stories. But this also means, by taking on different stories, that we as an animal can be shapeshifters who embody the essence of different beings. We can tell the story of a fox, or of a bunny rabbit, or of a daisy, or of an oak tree, and we can take on some of the essence of these other beings as we tell their stories. We are also animals with bodies that have cultural minds, and these minds are able to create imaginary worlds. So, for example, we are able to know how the earth was born and can tell her story with reverent love. So, while a lot of people don't know that there was a proto-Earth and another proto-planet, something that was forming to become a planet, that has been given the name Theia, and that there was a giant impact between these two proto-planets that gave rise to the Earth and the Moon, and that Theia at one point in time was about 60% the size of the Earth, and that a lot of Theia's matter became part of the Earth, making it slightly larger. And as the Earth and Moon collided and exploded and shattered these two planetoids, as they reformed, they made the Earth and the Moon. And what many people don't know is we have plate tectonics and the movement of our continents, which is key to the living processes of the Earth because of the tidal forces of our moon and its close orbit to the surface of our home planet. We're able to know this story and with reverent love to say, Theia sacrificed her life to the proto-Earth, and the proto-Earth sacrificed her life, and from both were born Terra and Luna, the Earth and the Moon. And that the Earth and the Moon created very narrow and specific and fragile conditions to sustain life, specifically enabling water to exist at the surface in liquid, solid, and vapor, which turns out to be essential for forming life. And we can tell this story scientifically, we can tell this story mythically, and we're an animal that's capable of doing it. But also, we can embody the energy of the serpent or the hummingbird or the frog, or as this Mayan mask shows, a shaman taking on the form of the jaguar, the jaguar in Espanol. This is a very powerful ability to shapeshift, to use plant medicine, to take toxic chemicals from the back of frogs and other things from the forest, to have fungi, and to have an altered mind state through medicinal ceremonies, and take on the embodiment of non-human species and channel them into the human world, which is the role of the shaman. So not only are we as humans able to tell the story of our cosmic evolution and the birth as well as the death of our home planet, but we can also take on animal forms other than our own, empathize and embody with them, and draw wisdom from them to learn how to live in harmony with the rest of nature. So humans are the part of Gaia who can know in a scientific sense and love in a spiritual sense. Humans are the part of Gaia who can know and love Gaia, doing this in a uniquely human way. So, what if we got our name wrong? What if we are not Homo sapiens, or the wise hominid, but instead we're Homo ludens, the hominid that plays, the hominid, as the stage represents, who enacts plays in the theater of our minds? How do we do that? Well, if I'm in a space filled with photons, My brain and my body are able to take those photons in, process them through my brain, and create stories rich with meaning. So I can have those photons enter my brain and look around and see tables and chairs and people sitting at desks and faces with expressions and emotions. I can see indoors and outdoors. I can see all of these patterns as rich stories because of the capacities of my body and my brain to process information that enters my body through my perceptual systems, my visual cortex, my hearing, my touch, my other parts of my somatic or my body-based capacity to interact with my surroundings. So, while you are not consciously aware of the photons hitting your retinas, doing things like detecting colors, defining edges, and more, your mind is doing all of this for you. And normally speaking, this is a good thing, because if you had to be consciously aware of all this information processing, like one way I like to say it is, you don't want to sit and have to work through where the edges and boundaries are when a lion is jumping at you out of the bushes. You want to be able to jump out of the way and not get eaten. So for very important evolutionary reasons, this theater of the mind is created outside of our conscious awareness. It's as if for free, we live in a story rich with semantics, rich with meaning. We live in a world, a universe of stories created by our minds. And at the same time, because of our evolutionary history, we have very little direct experience of how our bodies create these stories, just as we have very little conscious awareness of what our visual cortex is doing to be able to see what's happening in the surroundings around us. So we create stories as though we're sleepwalking. We create stories from our unconscious place and oftentimes do not have conscious awareness that we're creating these stories. So awakening the dreamer is about realizing that we habitually and unconsciously create and populate the world with stories. You live in dream worlds. Your dream worlds, like this webinar, like your ability to sit in a room and think that there's someone else sitting beside you. These are dream worlds created by your own mind. And they do correspond with some reality separate from your mind, because your mind arises from that larger reality. But your only way to access it is through these story worlds created by your mind. So what are some of the stories that we unconsciously live out, these mythologies that we live that aren't real except our mind makes them real? I'll give a few examples. The global economy, money, nations, private property, the past, the future, your identity, the idea that we're separate from nature, the idea you could be a victim or that you could be the victor, or a whole bunch of other mythic stories that we live out as though they are real, even though they're actually creations of our minds. Now, that doesn't mean that the real world doesn't exist. It only means that there's great power in crafting the story of money, or crafting the story of nation states, or crafting the story that we're separate from nature. You see, the stories we create of our own past, the stories we create of our possible futures, are stories that shape the stories of how we figure out who we are and what our identities are. These are stories we can choose and change. But most of the time, we blindly live stories created by our culture and enacted like plays in the theater of our minds. And awakening the dreamer is about knowing that this is what is happening and choosing which stories to create. So what happens if we wake up? What happens if we know we've been living in these stories of a dream world? What happens if we start to choose the stories that we live in instead of unconsciously accepting them? Notice how this is related to the conversation we've been having about decolonizing our minds. Most of us have stories that colonized us. We are, in a sense, the victims of the perpetrator stories of colonizer cultures. And we can awaken to these stories and the stories have less power over us. But then we can also start to choose the stories that we want to live. As we do this, we can also awaken in the dream, meaning we can become aware that we're dreaming while we're still dreaming. There's a name for this. It's called lucid dreaming. Lucid dreaming is when while you're asleep, you're dreaming. Maybe you're dreaming about flying in the clouds. And then you become aware through some part of your mind that you're actually dreaming. And because you're aware that you're dreaming, you can start to have some influence over how the dream moves forward, because you can start to make some choices. You could choose to hide under the covers. You could choose to get out of bed. You could choose a lot of different things. Now, what's amazing about being awake in this moment in time is that being awake to the culture you're living in doesn't mean that that culture goes away. Other people are still living in that story, but you start to see that you were sleepwalking in that story, but now something's different. There's a space, a gap, an emotional and felt difference between your reality and the reality of those around you. Now, for those of us who are what I've been calling collapse aware, this actually creates a lot of loneliness, feelings of powerlessness, isolation, and separation, because we feel like everyone around us is a little crazy, or we're crazy, and either way, we can't talk about our inner experience because we don't know how to relate to other people. So one of the scariest parts of this lucid dreaming is that when you awaken in the dream, usually, and so, unless you have some fairly special circumstances, usually you awaken alone and you don't know how to find the others who are awake. So a lot of what we're doing in this learning journey is that we found each other and we want to practice lucid dreaming together. What I mean by that is we want to practice living out stories of regeneration that are not the same as the habitual stories of the colonizer cultures that we were all born into. So, as you awaken to the dream, you can start to find your way out of the old cultural stories. Here is a lucid dreamer dressed in their business suit, being told that they should just be a tool of corporations. And yet somehow they know their life is about more than increasing quarterly profits for investors and owners of stock traded in stock markets in the global financial system. Something about that feels illusory and fake. And as this person becomes aware that they can be something different than just a tool for corporations and tool for the extraction of wealth by the capitalist game, they can actually use their mind to create a staircase. They can use their mind to imagine the existence of a door. They can use their mind to feel that there's another world that is possible, and they can start to seek it. And in your dream world, what's amazing is dreams don't have to be real to be powerful. So the staircase may not exist. This door may not exist. This other world may not exist. But in the dream world, you can start to imagine that it might be and look for it. And then find that there are other stories in the real world, like the story I told of the Ojibwa people and the story of Wetiko that is included in our homework assignment this week. The story about the illusion of separation and cultural pathologies that are being instigated by dominator cultures and extraction that ensues, destroying life. When there are other cultures, indigenous cultures, regenerative cultures, that find harmony with the rest of the natural world because they believe in interdependence and don't falsely believe in the illusion of separation. So what if we all dream together about the earth regenerated? What if we dream together about the connecting of human beings into the living flow of the earth system, so that human beings help reconnect biological corridors, restore and protect native ecosystems, that we start to guide the rehabilitation of climate patterns, that we restore ocean currents that maintain climate stability, that we start to bring the barrier reefs of the world, the coastal reef systems, back to life after their collapse, that we restore the health and vitality of the Amazon rainforest after it's been deforested and fragmented to the edge of collapse. If we start to imagine that we can embody the consciousness of Gaia, that we can be a story of Gaia alive, knowing herself, and that Gaia is now a planetary living system that includes human beings who lucid dream as Gaia, which means Gaia knows she is dreaming because her humans are aware that we are dreaming as Gaia. And this may well be the evolutionary leap forward that saves our species from extinction. And this may well be what it means to walk the regenerative pathway of, or the design pathway of regenerating the earth. So, if humans can dream, and we are a part of the living evolution of the earth, this means the earth herself is the one dreaming us into being, because we are the earth dreaming. And if we are dreamers and the earth made us, then the earth is dreaming through us, and we can become conscious and conscientious. We can be the conscience in an ethical and spiritual sense, and we can be conscious as in mindful, attentive, and aware that we are the earth caring for herself. And the people of the Central Andes call this Pachamama. The people of the indigenous pagan traditions of the Mediterranean called this Gaia. And this is what we are invited to become as regenerators of the earth. So the key here is not just to become a lucid dreamer. Many people are awakened to the brokenness of their cultural stories. The key is to become Gaia consciousness, and therefore act as a steward and servant, as a regenerator of the earth. All of this done in service to life of our entire precious biosphere. So are you ready to dream together? Because that is what we have to do for the rest of our time together on this learning journey and from now forward. So like I said, I think this is a very powerful idea and a very powerful topic for discussion. And I'm really excited to have this conversation with all of you, which is, Gail's saying we're not the only animals with cultural evolution. That is absolutely true, Gail. There are thousands of species that have cultural evolution, but there are not thousands of species that have semantic abilities to create narratives and live them out and to accumulate cultural change. And this idea that we are the lucid dreamers in ways that dolphins may dream, but they may not dream the way that we can dream, is part of the power of saying Gaia just might need her humans. And even if she doesn't need them in some deep ontological way, maybe we could also say that she deserves her humans. Gaia deserves to have humans dreaming lucidly on her behalf. And that we can be this gift to Gaia if only we can find enough love in ourselves and enough capacity to have reverence and humility for how big this evolutionary story is that we are just a little participant in. So I'm really looking forward to our conversation today. I'm very curious what you all are thinking and feeling, and I'd love to start a conversation. So firstly, just in the chat box, how are you feeling? What's bubbling up for you as we begin to have this deeper conversation? I think this is really important. So Gail's saying she's confused. I guess we can touch on some of the points of confusion. And I see that Luis is feeling a profound sense, I would imagine a sense of connection. Chris is feeling energized. What else are you guys feeling? Throw some thoughts in the chat box. And also, if you have questions, go ahead and write them into the Ask a Question button, and we can start to have some discussion. What I think is really important here is, as Kathy is saying, yes, first we dream it and then we do it. And notice how dreaming it is not the same as living it, which means we don't have to know how the story ends. We just need to know how the story feels. And we can practice that with dreaming. Yeah, Jonathan, I also feel this is transformative. I feel like what this transforms is it transforms the human story. So for all of you who don't know my history, in 2007 and 2008, I worked with the founder of cognitive linguistics, George Lakoff. And at the time, I wanted to reframe global warming so that we could help get more people to care about it. And what I came to realize was to reframe global warming, we needed to reframe two other major domains. One was we had to reframe what we think is the economy and the entire discourse about economics. And that we needed to reframe what it means to be human in multiple ways. And so a lot of what I'm doing now in this webinar is inviting us into a way that we can reframe what it means to be human, which is that we are a part of Gaia, becoming self-aware, that is capable of choosing to act in service to Gaia, and that it's actually our choice. And as Julian's saying, yes, it's a crisis of perception because our perceptual systems prior to satellites and the Earth observing system, we did not have perceptual systems that could see the entire dynamic Earth. If you all remember last week's webinar, I showed a computer simulation of the Earth's climate and said this ability to perceive in 4 dimensions, in 3 temporal dimensions, and in time is new, and that we actually have put on new perceptual systems for the Earth because we're part of the Earth by having those abilities. And so what I think is really powerful is to bridge what Pamela is saying about the end of the Holocene, is that there's actually really good evidence that when the Holocene began, agriculture was invented in several places on Earth at the same time, all within about a 1,000-year time frame. What that means is that convergently, some empire was probably going to give rise to the first globalized civilization. It just happened that it was one of the empires or a collection of the empires from Western Europe. But what's interesting is that it could have been from somewhere else, although Jared Diamond, in his book Guns, Germs, and Steel, makes a pretty compelling case for why it probably would have come from Europe instead of somewhere else, because of continental geographic things, not specifically because of the cultures themselves. But what's interesting is to think that maybe one of these agricultural empires would have become a global civilization during this time, which means humans would have ended the Holocene in some form. But what are we birthing? What is being created? And this is the question for us as Earth regenerators. What are we giving birth to in service for our lives? So I'm just curious that what are you all thinking and feeling? And I'm enjoying sort of responding to some of the provocations in the chat, but also we can start to have some questions or some topics come up for more interactive discussion. Like, I think that what Media is saying about the delicate dance of agency here is that if we take embodiment seriously and recognize that our perceptual systems interacting with our environments shape how we perceive our agency, and that in a realistic sense, our supposed free will and our individualism are profoundly limited by these interdependencies, that actually, the more we understand that, the more we can take our genuine agency, the one that's authentic and real, and embed it within that interdependency. And as we do that, we co-create with the rest of life. By the way, this is what I'm doing in the bioparque as I'm walking around pulling grass and helping to build a soil substrate that enables the native seeds. And Kathy and I have been doing this in the last month, that the native seeds are self-propagating. And all I'm doing is co-creating with that ecosystem and its patterns. And the beautiful thing is how easy my part is. I pull the grass, I weed a little bit the invasive grass, and I help the soils. The rest is done by the rest of Gaia. And I'm very humble in knowing I didn't plant any of that. I did help it by understanding some of it. And so this is a really important thing. And I think that the more we practice being Gaia consciousness, and if we actually learn some earth system science and ecological science, that'll really help too. That will actually have this grounding in concrete ways that'll help to keep us humble. Jan's asking the question, how do we avoid woo-woo hubris and ego and be accountable to the humble relationships in our dreaming? I actually think the best way to do this is to deeply recognize our embodiment. A very simple, profound way to do this. If you don't think you have an embodied mind, hold your breath and see how long you survive without oxygen. Or stop eating and stop drinking and see how long your body and your mind will function without those inputs. Or stop sleeping and see how long it takes for you to go insane because your mind can't make sense of anything anymore and your emotions stop functioning correctly. Or if you want to go crazy, give yourself partial lobotomy and watch how your brain has changed. See, what I'm saying here is that as we understand how we are bodies dancing with stories in the cosmos, that this doesn't go woo-woo, it goes realistic. It connects us back to the fact that we have to breathe to not be dead. And then we have to eat and drink and sleep because our bodies require it. And the more profound expansion of this is that we can't live without biodiversity. Without a healthy biosphere of the planet, our species is going to be pretty limited in its survival capabilities. So I think this is really an important part of it. There's much more to explore here, but that's just one avenue, is if you take your embodiment seriously, you become humble by just how much your body is you and how much you can't survive and have the mind you have without your body. So Pamela is asking a really interesting question. She asked, can you speak to the relationship between dreaming and story? And can we live without story? The answer is yes, we can live without story if someone puts you on a life support system. It's called being in a coma. And it turns out that a great neuroscientist, Antonio Damasio, wrote a book called The Feeling of What Happens, which came out in 2002, where he gave a fully neurological account of consciousness. And he separated consciousness into different levels, where one level gives rise to the emergence of the next through 3 levels, to show that a person can be comatose and they're surviving with their brain stem, keeping their heart beating and keeping their lungs going, but they can't awaken and seek food or seek water, so they would die without someone giving them food and water intravenously. And so there's this level that there is being alive, but not being awake. And there are different kinds of consciousness between the brain and body, keeping your heart beating, and you having what he called the highest level, which he called autobiographical self, which is the conscious experience of being a being living out a story. Like I'm a being who picks up a hairbrush and runs it through my hair. I'm a being who grabs a water bottle and opens it to take a drink of water. This is the autobiographical self. I am consciously aware of myself living out a story through my conscious actions. So what this means is the level of human semantics, where we're able to have meaning and act in the world for human bodies, requires us to be within a story. By the way, George Lakoff and Mark Johnson talked about this with something called image schemas and something called the source path goal image schema, which is that all stories have a beginning, go through a series of steps, and come to an ending. But also, if I have my hand here and I decide I want to take my other hand to touch it, to choreograph the movement with my sensory motor cortex and with the part of my brain that moves my muscles and skeleton, I have to coordinate between a beginning and move through a sequence of steps to an ending. And this sequence has the source, the path, and the goal as a structure, which means the part of my brain that coordinates body movement helps create the capacity for story. And without that part of my brain functioning, I can't create story, so I can't make sense of anything because of the way the human body works. So what this means is you cannot dream without story because the dream will make no sense without the structures, the very basic structures, like this source, path, goal structure, which is only one element of a story, or the autobiographical self of being a member of the story, acting it out. Those are both cognitive elements of the part of our mind that creates stories, which enables us to dream, which means dreaming is an emergent and complex capacity that depends on more basic biological capacities. So I just wanted to say that to say you cannot dream without story because the dream will make no sense. The sense making requires the capacities that arise as story making occurs. And Simone is asking, how did we end up here? What are the main characteristics of humans that made us being today at the edge of collapse? Well, what's interesting, Simone, is that this is something that has a lot of answers and a lot of parts. And so I don't want to try and go into all of them. But one of them is there's a concept in biology called eusocial, EU social. A eusocial organism is an organism that has complex social structure and that members of the same generation have differentiated economic roles. So an example of this is ants. You can have soldier ants, you can have harvester ants, you can have the queen ant, you can have the caretaker ants, all in the same generation with a complex social structure. So ants are a eusocial insect. Turns out prairie dogs are a eusocial mammal. Whales are a eusocial animal, or eusocial mammal. Humans have these eusocial capabilities. So part of what enabled humans to get here is that we have a language and social and emotional set of capacities due to the history of social niche construction that we talked about briefly in an earlier webinar that gave rise to our social interdependence. You actually can't be born and develop and grow without a lot of social support, without a lot of cultural scaffolding. And so these biological capacities that gave rise to these other more complex things are part of that story. But there's so much more. We could spend a lot of time just talking about that. I see the media is just suggesting some nice resources for us that everyone can look at in the chat. And Pamela's talking about, speaking of the right and wrong story connected with Jan's question. I think it's really important that whatever stories we live into, that the stories are consistent with how the universe actually works. And if I was to pick a single book to tell that story, I would pick Michael Dowd's book, which I think was published in 2006. It's called Thank God for Evolution. And what Michael Dowd does in Thank God for Evolution is he very thoughtfully explores the mythic aspect of storytelling in religions and shows how all of our early, like say Judeo-Christian stories, the Abrahamic stories, all had particular structures because they came out of early agricultural empires. And that also there were a lot of elements of indigenous stories that told things like telling things in cycles and being in the present moment. And there are many elements of those stories that are still good to keep going now. But there are many elements of them that are not suited to these times because they're simply not true. And what's happening and the complexities of what's happening right now is, to the best of our ability, our stories need to teach people how to live in the right relationship to the present, which includes right relationship to the past as it actually occurred. That relates to decolonization, but also right relationship to the potential future. If we use our water and soil in the right relationship now, there will be a future. If we don't use it in right relationship to now, we go extinct and there isn't a future. So this right relationship is temporal and causal, cause-effect relationships. And what he found in Thank God for Evolution is that the cosmic evolution story, the big history story, some of which I shared in today's webinar, that we know how the solar system formed, we know how the Earth formed, we know the Big Bang and this cosmic narrative. By the way, Brian Swim has written and spoken eloquently about this for a very long time, as have others. Yeah, it's called The Great Story by Brian Swim. Thank you, Gail. I see Gail and I are totally online on this part of it. That this enables us to have a universe story in common. And anyone who has a cultural mythology because there'll be many different cultures, can still have their mythology, but the structure of the story needs to be consistent with the great story of the universe, because that actually lets us be in right relationship to the past and to the future. And this is actually a vital part that science has given us, even though there have been so many problems that have come up during this modern era, and that gave rise to globalization. So you see that this is a way of awakening your dreamer, because each of us is an imaginal cell in the fractal story of the universe, lived out in the Gaia story of our home planet, expressed in the hominid line of Homo sapiens, or maybe Homo ludens, at the end of the Holocene and the beginning of what comes next. And maybe the Anthropocene, which is the time where the chemical characteristics of the crust of the earth will leave a mark for millions of years into the future. This geologic strata will show that human globalization occurred here. Now, this Anthropocene moment could give rise to Gaia consciousness and Gaia homeostasis. Gaia herself creating something like the Holocene conditions for a complex organism like the human to be able to participate in Gaia processes. And so this is something that I think is really important for us to sit with deeply, take walks, hold it seriously. This is a really big thing. So Gail has asked the question, says, Michael Dowd has been trying to change people's story for years. The change is slow. How to accelerate it? I'm going to invite Gail onto the screen because we've been sort of ripping anyway in the chat box. What I'll start to say is Michael has become deeply aware from studying historic societal collapses that during societal collapse, almost no one wakes up. So the answer is, partly at least, don't try to get a mass movement because it's almost guaranteed to fail. But instead, form mycelial networks of people who already get it. But anyway, Gail, how are you doing?
I'm good. I have to say, Michael's who woke me up. I mean, I was on my way there anyway, because I was born an environmentalist, basically, mostly through my connection with animals. But I'm a Unitarian Universalist, and they had an article in there, the Denominations magazine, on Michael and his wife, Connie. And I read the article and my mind went, and I started following him, and he was writing the book at the time. I even helped him a little. I helped edit it a little bit. And then, I started, that's how I found you. He interviewed you in a series of podcasts that he did. And I heard you, and you were like my next one when I heard you.
High five.
But anyway, so yeah, you kind of answered my question just now, because I don't follow Michael as closely, but I still occasionally do, and it just seems like he's out there. He has a great story, which I'd like to tell people, is he was a born-again Christian, and he became a born-again minister, and totally changed. I forget what it was. It changed his point of view, but then
I remember it was his first wife, because his first wife was a biologist and an atheist. And they argued, because of course he's very smart and very intellectual, so is she. They argued about evolution, and she converted him. And he's like, wait, if I'm an evangelical Christian, I need to have a gospel that is my life's mission. And he said, my gospel is the science of evolution as a spiritual story.
And then he became a Unitarian Universalist minister. So that's why he was on the cover of the magazine. Yeah, so, he blew my mind. But I guess, so I guess what you're saying is that not everybody has to buy into the story, but we need enough people to buy into it. Is that what you're saying?
I would say yes, and one other point, which is those of us who get this story need to support each other in living it together. so that it becomes a cultural story and not just a story that some wacko crazy person like Joe's got his weird story. There needs to be, and I'm not talking about forming a cult here either, where we're this like religious group. It's more like those of us who get it, we understand that this planet that we are a part of has an evolutionary history that humans have a legitimate place in. We are something in that story, and we have empowering things we can do right now. And it's very crucial, not just for humans to avoid extinction, but we could keep 10 million or 80 million other species from going extinct as the biosphere continues unraveling, like what you're doing with the parrots, and what Connie, Michael's wife, what she does with trees in California. She's a tree walker, for those who don't know.
Assisted migration,
she assists migration. She brings trees to Canada because they can't migrate quickly enough on their own with climate change. That is Gaia service. That is doing something in service to how the biosphere actually works. And
I want to say, I am an atheist. And for me, the great story has become my sacred story. There's a song by a guy named Peter Meyer called Everything is Holy Now. Oh, the best. It's the best. It's all about something as simple as a little red-winged bird singing in a bush is holy. It's such a wonderful song. You don't have to, certainly there are plenty of people who do believe in God and they have their own sacred stories, and that's fine. But if you don't have that, just listen to that song. It'll get you on.
And by the way, I'm grabbing the link right now for everyone to put in the chat box, because there's a version that Connie, Michael's wife, actually created a beautiful video version. Yes. This song is gorgeous. Yeah, this song is just gorgeous. Well, Gail, I'm glad we found each other.
Me too. And reply to my email about the website.
Yeah, I'm on it. Okay. If you watch Spirit Airlines collapsing as a company this week, we were one of the canceled flights. They're canceling half their flights every day as their company's going under. So we have some fun this week.
Yeah, all right. Enjoy the wedding.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye. I see another question has come in here. Let me go and look and see whose it was. This one from Bob. Bob, I'll invite you onto the screen. He says, can you lucidly dream of something that you don't have direct knowledge of? Lucidly dream of regeneration when you don't have full-time perception of ecology and life. I have a specific example of that, Bob, that I will share when you come online. And Jonathan, I'll try and give a concise description of the universe story, but the best will be, see if Bob's able to join us, is if someone here can do a search for The Great Story by Brian Swimme. Someone can maybe go and grab a good link to that and drop it in the chat. Bob, I don't know. Oh, there you come. Hey there, Bob. Are you there? Hello.
Yeah, I lost you though.
Yeah. Can you hear me? Can you hear me okay?
I can hear you.
Awesome. Seems there's a little time lag, so we'll do our best with this.
All right.
I wanted to answer your question in a very concrete way, and then we can riff on it together. Because I practiced lucid dreaming as a teenager, and also as a teenager, I had budding sexuality, which means I lucid dreamed about sexual fantasies before I had lost my virginity, which means I would have just sexually potent dreams because my body was generating all those hormones and all that energy. And I had a lot of self-shame and humiliation about my body. So I was really uncomfortable with any thought of actually being intimate with someone. And I grappled with that. So in my dream world, where I would start to have what for me were embarrassing sexual explorations with girls I knew in school that my mind was doing while I was asleep, I would try to find ways to be aware in my dreams, to try to be nice and respectful, to learn how to talk to them and have conversations, things I couldn't do in my waking world because I was too embarrassed and insecure at that point in my life. And so what I found was I was lucid dreaming about sexual experiences before I'd had them, which means I didn't know if they were realistic or not, because I didn't have any lived experience to base it on. But my body was creating sexual fantasies anyway because I was in that stage of life. And so I was exploring the mystery. Right now I'm reading a really good book by Bill Plotkin, and he's named that a key part of adolescence as a life stage is to embrace and explore mystery. As I was exploring the mystery of sexual interaction and of kind of intimacy and creativity with other people. And a lot of that exploration happened while I was sleeping because I was afraid and unprepared to do it in my waking world. And I think this is a nice kind of domain to think about. How do we do the same thing for Earth regeneration, where it doesn't matter where we are in our life stages, that there's a mystery part where we can try to imagine and explore without knowing if it's correct, what it means to participate in regenerating the Earth, which is similar to being like a 14-year-old kid having sexual fantasies without knowing if they're realistic. And so I suspect there's a deep parallel there. But I'm curious what that evokes in you.
I can see that's realistic. I'm sure, most people have some version of that at different levels. If I can remember back that far. But I guess what I'm, if I was a Cro-Magnon 30,000 years ago or something, and I was standing in nature and looking at it, it was part of me. It was, I could feel the mycelia running into my blood veins almost. It's and to me that's the level at which we need to get back to eventually, keeping all of the knowledge that has been gained since then and using it properly. But that feeling, and I just used Cro-Magnon as an, a guess. Loon and Robinson's, shaman book. But I don't see that when I walk out, and I really try. Maybe I'm trying too hard. Maybe it's something that just has to come. Maybe it's just, I don't know, I have a deep love of nature, and I try, and I've been a gardener for 35 years. I love the soil, and I love all of that kind of stuff. And yet, it's, to me, it's not apparent that I have that intimacy yet, that perception. And so I'm just wondering if it's possible to lucidly dream of something that I don't have. I understand your example, but I just don't know if that fits this particular instance or not.
Well, one thing I was really struck by when I read Wade Davis's book, One River, as he talked about Richard Evans Schultz going and visiting a lot of shamanic tribes and learning about their plant medicines in the Andes and in the Amazon. And he discovered ayahuasca, and he went to the southwest of North America and learned about peyote. He helped find the active ingredient that's in psychotropic mushrooms and brought all of this to the scientific world. And one thing that I was really surprised by was in these tribal cultures where people did ayahuasca, it wasn't just the shamans, it was most of the community. And they did them almost daily. Like they did them all the time. They didn't just do them like on the full moon or when there was a really special ritual. Just there was a group of people who were interacting with plant medicine to be in altered psychedelic states a lot of the time. Like most of the time. What I'm struck by with this is not to say we should all be drugged out all the time. Not that I mean it in a negative way, but that there was a deeper connection that they recognized was helpful for them. And they actually built it in as a functional part of their culture. And I think the way that so many of us in our culture distract ourselves with movies, with alcohol, with video games, and all sorts of altered mind states, actually tells us that we seek those altered mind states because they don't give us meaning. And so we're addicted to the pulse of what it gives us emotionally, but not the conclusion, the culmination of it having meaning for us. But if you were to have the equivalent of ayahuasca connection while you're gardening, you'd feel that connection. And mindfulness practices with breathing and synchronized movement actually creates altered mind states. And so, in the Buddhist tradition, for example, people achieve enlightenment by having this blissful state of connection. And so it's the same connection that the ayahuasca connection is talking about, just arrived at in a very different way. And so just as to say that our wisdom traditions in many different cultures are about bringing this connection back into our daily lives and recultivating it with a rhythm that we remain either connected or reconnected quickly when we lose connection, is my sense of it from what I've seen. Lots to think about there, huh?
Yeah. I mean, like I said earlier, I was trying to work with the teacher and see if that helps, but we'll go from there.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Bob. Onward we go.
Thank you.
And I see there's one more question here I want to get a chance to get to before we stop. I see. It was just Claire dropping that in the question instead of the chat. So I guess that means we don't have any more questions. Or are there any more questions jumping out in the chat? Maybe let's just do to have a closing together. I want to invite something very simple. In the chat box, if you would, share some part of this story, the Gaia story, that you think should be present. Just share it in the chat box. So I'll give one. I think part of the story is the knowledge of Earth system science. I think part of this story is to know actually how our planetary system works so that we can act in service to it. Just like you'd want your medical doctor to know how your body works and your physiology works to be able to give you medical support. I would say this is something that I would like to see in this story. Not in the story all the time, but that's something I would put in. But just in the chat, just drop something that you think should be in this story. So Gail's saying, conscious evolution is the earth learning to sing opera. Isn't that a quote from Michael Dowd? I think it is. If Gail's dropping it there. Yeah, leave it to Michael to be a poet. So plant spirit medicine, I totally agree. How does your pain relate to Gaia's pain? Ooh, Julian, that's a good one. I think there's depth of healing to be found there. Affirm one another, kindness, being present, says Claire. Lovelock's work on healing Gaia, says Jonathan, which I think Jonathan and I are really aligned on that one. Pamela says cautionary tales and awareness of what makes the wrong story. I think this part of indigenous cultures of having stories as morality tales is really important. What's the moral of the story? Simona says part of the story is respect for life in all forms. I totally resonate with that. Are there any others? Joel's saying flows of energy and constant change. You can see this relating to some of the early Greeks, the Stoic philosophers talked about that too. Jan is saying, yes, to integrate earth science with body and earth connection. I think embodiment in our bodily practices. For me, dance, martial arts, my stretch routine, breathing meditations, mindfulness practice, and plant medicine and these other things, all part of it. Dominic is saying biophysical economics, systems ecology, which I would say for Dominic's post, for those of you who don't know Nathan Hagen's, read anything by him, because Dominic and I'd be like, high fives to Nathan, because that's what he talks about in deep ways. Marcus says this co-creative aspect that I would even add at a deeper level, Marcus, that we can never not co-create. We are always co-creating, so let's practice being mindful and aware when, how, and why we are. Chad says the power of imagination and play, high fives on that. Gail's saying back to Wetico, make greed a disgusting value, like smoking perhaps. And Gail, what's parallel of that I see is so interesting is I'm learning to decolonize tobacco, where smoking is no longer disgusting. in the context of using tobacco in ceremony. We can talk more about that, but I totally get what you're saying, just adding it. And Mehdi is saying, what are the foundation culture stories of place? I think each place needs its foundation culture stories. Each place needs its stories of its own ecological web in the way that Wendell Berry or David Abram might articulate. So Mehdi, totally with you there. So I feel with the responses that you all are giving that we're getting what this is about. Awakening your dreamer is by feeling into what part of the story do you feel should be there? And then how do you embody that story in your own life? And this gets back to cultural scaffolding. How do we help each other to embody these different parts of our story? It's so beautiful and so powerful. So thank you all for this. This is just so beautiful to me. Like I said at the beginning, I feel like where we're going now in the learning journey is really important. And we would have lost our way trying to get here alone. So this is like Ubuntu. I am because we are. On this journey together, we're able to come here. I couldn't have created this presentation without you being here and knowing and being attuned to where we are on this journey. So this is something we are truly co-creating, as Marcus was reminding us. So I just want to thank you all for being here. Thank you all for being a part of this emerging story. And to say, I'm going to go to this hotel room downstairs, take some pictures, be part of a wedding. It's going to be a little strange. And the part of it that I'm holding is that Pachamama is with me. And I know that the way we live is not just to disconnect from the cultural stories we find disgusting and bothersome, but to return to the places where they are, carrying this other story within us and just seeing how it affects the world. So I'm going to do that today, and I'm excited to see how we all do this together and alone in the days ahead. So thank you all. Look forward to the community Zoom calls in the next few days, and onward, fellow humans.